We can review something that we have mentioned previously in this class, which is related to accidents. And I had mentioned, or I used this quote from Paul Virilio before, talking about the amount of technology which has increased the amount of accidents that exist. Every technology produces, provokes, and programs a specific accident. For example, when they invented the railroad, what did they invent? An object that allowed you to go fast, which allowed you to progress, a vision a la Jules Verne, positivism, evolutionism, but at the same time, they invented the railway catastrophe. The invention of the boat was the invention of shipwrecks, the invention of the steam engine and the locomotive was the invention of derailments, the invention of the highway was the invention of 300 cars colliding in 5 minutes, the invention of the airplane was the invention of the plane crash. And of course, this is a statement made in the 80s and way before the advent of the modern technology that we are talking about today, and also in the context of the arms race, partly the nuclear arms race that was happening in the Cold War, partly what happened following the Cold War. But in and of itself, there is a context that most people are generally aware of when it comes to accidents related to technology, and that is road accidents. And of course, this is part of the conversation that Virilio mentioned just a second ago. 500 cars at the same time on the road create more accidents. But even on top of that, the possibility of having more cars with people using technology at the same time, and those cars being made of increasing amounts of technology themselves, means even more accidents happening. This example here from Ms. Morero's injuries sustained while walking and using a smartphone reminder. If you replace walking with driving, the situation becomes more serious. Center for Disease Control reported on their website that in 2011, 3,331 people were killed nationwide and 387,000 were injured in motor vehicle crashes involving an inattentive driver. The U.S. Safety Council estimated that 23% of all car crashes, which includes crashes caused by inattention, as well as another approximately million crashes for other reasons, involved cell phone use. And in that context, of course, the number of accidents increases kind of exponentially. That if you can be distracted by your cell phone while walking, you will be even more distracted by driving at a fast speed in a car that is increasingly also connected through a variety of technology. And some of it is certainly a matter of an accident, certainly, but also some of that is a matter of people changing fundamentally their behavior and perhaps being a little bit more less focused on one task and more focused on another rather than the task at hand, particularly. That is not something that is unique to the combination of those various accidents, of course. There is a pretty large increase of people being struck by lightning while using their cell phones. Here, the example from Jaipur, India last year, lightning strike kills 16 people taking selfies in India, 16 people at the same time, and many more injured while taking pictures or taking pictures of themselves with their hands up, using a piece of metal in their hand while the lightning is hitting. And from this article, we have lightning strikes kill some 2,000 Indians on average every year, according to official data. Now, of course, this is a kind of a different class of accident, but still related to the one we were just mentioning before. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of millions of people living in a very short amount of space with a piece of metal attached to themselves, which becomes a literal lightning rod for a very natural problem out of that. And this is probably a matter of technology to a certain extent, but it is also a matter of the larger context in which things are happening. The large-scale urbanization of India in the past few decades is something that is also a matter of a technology, but a matter of politics, a matter of economy, a much larger issue than the technology itself. And of course, the behavior of people here is also to be mentioned because there is another series of accidents that can be mentioned in the context of selfies, which is people kind of roping animals into their pictures, sometimes roping other humans and smaller humans as well. But animals have been falling prey or victims to selfies. For example, here, a dolphin that was taken out of the sea and dragged onto the beach for people to take pictures or to take selfies with the animal, which obviously is not the animal's natural habitat. And eventually, the dolphin died as a result of the attention around people. And in that context here, is this an accident that is due to the cell phone itself, or is it really a matter of people being ultra focused on the thing that we're trying to do, which is to take a selfie, perhaps being self-absorbed to a very large extent, as opposed to the larger context in which those things are happening. This is happening on the beach. The um, cell phones are really an accessory to all of this, but certainly if you removed this cell phone, if you removed the technology that allowed people to take selfie, then there would be no selfie to take, and there would be no animals to rope into these conversations. Now, if we consider these accidents and these kind of unintended consequences in terms of behavior to the way in which the technology is affecting our lives and the lives of the people around us, you already have a pretty large amount of discussion that can be had around the health effects of the cell phones, whether the health is happening at a biological level or whether it is happening at the ecological level for the people around us. But there's another dimension to that is the fact that this is also a larger perception of ourselves that is changing. And whether we are talking about these events happening in the news or maybe in a medical journal of some sort, there is also a whole lot of discourse around those particular elements and whether or not those elements of technology are to be received in more or less strong ways by society around us. So the example here of a few articles taken about video games, especially man dies in Taiwan after a 3-day online gaming binge. Person just did not stop playing, did not stop playing to relieve themselves or to sleep, and eventually died of exhaustion. A video game addict kills his mother. A boy 14 shoots and kills friend during video game dispute. And also, of course, in the context of mass shooters and video games being routinely blamed for a connection with mass shootings in the United States. And here, of course, the question is, what is the technology? Is the technology the guns, or is the technology the video game? Is the technology the video game that comes between people and their experience, or is it the conversation of the video game coming with, sorry, between people and the world around them? One could perhaps replace the other, one could perhaps intrude on the other. So one world mixing with the other and a confusion happening as a result of that would create also disaster consequences. And again, these things have been studied, of course, because since we have had these technologies and since people have been more or less intrigued and perhaps scared of the results of technology intruding into our lives, there have been efforts made to make sense of exactly how much these things could imply intrude on our lives. So here an example from a journal of social psychology: time spent playing on 2 online shooters has no measurable effect on aggressive affect. And of course, if we are thinking of this in terms of the brain and people using their um, brain for one function, perhaps more or less distracted by it, perhaps more or less focused on it, the amount of mixing that is happening between those worlds, or the perhaps confusion that could happen between the video game world and the real world around it, is pretty limited, and therefore people who are playing video games will be more absorbed by their video game and much less absorbed by the world around them, meaning that it is sometimes pretty difficult to confuse the two if you know the difference between the two. That is not to say that there could not be accidents, of course, and this is, in fact, the topic of today's lecture, the accidents that could happen of people maybe momentarily being distracted by the video game or by the firearm that they are carrying and focusing on the immediate results of whatever is affecting them rather than focusing on the long-term effects of what those pieces of technology could have in their lives. The deeper effects of these can be found, for example, is what is called junk sleep in this particular article here on CNN Health. People who are using their electronic devices in the bedroom apparently being um, affected to a, again, biological level by the lights showing up on their screens, by the cell phones that they are using, perhaps by the news that they are seeing on those cell phones, as we have mentioned previously in the context of doom scrolling. There is the possibility that you might be affected very deeply by this piece of technology that exists here. Now, this particular story is funded by the National Sleep Foundation and relying on polls, meaning that people who are uh, talking about their own experience, about their own observations, and here 95% of Americans use an electronic device within an hour of going to sleep. Electronic device could be a television, it could be something much wider than a cell phone, and of course, people watching television in their bedroom is not a particularly new phenomenon. It is not to say that these things are going to be a very important effect, but this is taken into account here. Televisions are the most common. MP3 players, tablets, and smartphones are also popular. And if you use your smartphone as an alarm clock, chances are you're literally going to bed with some form of electronic device. And yes, of course, in that context, 95% of Americans are using a piece of electronics before they go to bed. And it could also be their toothbrush. It could also be some other kind of electronic media that exists in our lives, and whether or not those things are directly affecting us or whether this is an article that is mostly designed for us to buy a new mattress makes these studies a little bit more confusing for everyone. And again, we are recovering our aspect of confusion here. If people can be confused by the technology in their hand, they can also be confused by the larger story that exists around using these electronics. And to a certain extent, we are particularly affected by the things around us as much as we are able to affect the world around us using those electronics. Here, another article focusing on the screen time and lower psychological well-being among children and adolescents. This is from a peer review study, so a little bit more trustworthy than the article on CNN Health. But the overall takeaway here is that there is a link between having access to certain electronic devices. So here, cell phones, computers, electronic devices, electronic games, and TV, and an array of psychological well-being measures. After 1 hour per day of use, more hours of daily screen time were associated with lower psychological well-being, including less curiosity, lower self-control, more distractibility, more difficulty making friends, etc., etc. And here, the results of the number of electronic devices combined with the number of factors that are affected by our use, combined with the number of people being affected by this on a much larger scale, means a whole lot more room for a social impact on the use um, of these objects. And there's another caveat to put here is that we also have, as we mentioned yesterday, a lot more data to measure this because our cell phones also allow us to measure our sleep these days. And you also have the, you know, dedicated devices that also allow you to look at these things, which was not previously available or affordable. And now we have the possibility to make very large scale studies about very large amounts of numbers and their very large interactions with the digital world before they go to sleep or, in their everyday life. The confusion, though, can still remain once you have this increasing pace at which new technology is coming in, whether or not this thing is being done properly, being studied properly. And again, if CNN and Health could create content that is designed to sell mattresses, similarly, other companies that have a little bit more of a financial stake in our well-being may also be able to produce science that is nor more or less nefarious or more or less biased in one way or another. We also had a pretty good example of that in the past couple of years with 5G and the new technologies for cell phones, which of course are everywhere these days and require the new wireless technologies, which is not visible, which is not something that we can touch or really pinpoint to a time or place. The waves that allow us to use cell phones or wireless internet are just all the time around us. Whether or not those things are properly tested or properly affecting us is sometimes a question for people who are not raised with this kind of environment and certainly not willing to trust the large companies that are selling us these products. This article here shows a variety of experimental studies provided no confirmed evidence that low-level MMWs, being millimeter waves, so the more powerful forms of wireless systems that are used especially for 5G, are associated with biological effects relevant to human health. Many of the studies reporting effects came from the same research groups, and the results have not been independently reproduced. The majority of the studies employed low-quality methods of exposure assessment and control, so the possibility of experimental artifact cannot be excluded. Further, many of the effects reported may have been related to heating from high RF radio frequency energy deposition, so the assertion of a quote-unquote low-level effect is questionable in many of the studies. Future studies into the low-level effects of MMWs could or should improve the experimental design with particular attention to dosimetry and temperature control. The results from epidemiological studies presented little evidence of an association between low-level MMWs and any adverse health effects. Future epidemiological research would benefit from a specific investigation on the impact of 5G and future telecommunication technology. So yes, there is an existing system that is supposed to provide us more information or more protection against these new technologies because those things are regulated, because for a very long time we have been aware of potential health effects. However, this is also moving us into the same direction that our politics is going, with less regulation, fewer levels of oversight on everything, more incentives to make more money, to roll out the new technology faster. And that does leave the potential for taking shortcuts, for not fully testing things. And people are generally aware of that, on top of a general distrust of corporations or news media, even science to a certain extent. And the accidents here are happening at every level of this. There is the accidents that come with using the technology. There is the accidents that come with using the technology from the provider point of view. There is the accident of this technology generating all kinds of science, including junk science, as much as it is generating large amounts of money for people involved. And so therefore, we are kind of caught in the middle of all of this, and we also have to do a lot more due diligence to the checking of our facts, the checking of our resources, the checking of our environment, and eventually, of course, the checking of our health. But our health is being affected at a very complex level, and it is not always easy to see which is the more important factor in our well-being being affected, whether it is something that is directly related to the technology or whether it is a byproduct of the technology itself.